How's everybody doing today? So, now that the Kavanaugh hearing debacle is over, I feel a little bit more comfortable talking about it with you guys. Especially because today I realized that I had an email from Rick Scott, who, if you don't know, is the governor of the state of Florida. Now, as you can see from this email, which should be on screen now, Rick Scott and I, we're on a first name basis because I'm a very important person. Rick and I go way back. Obviously, I'm being sarcastic. I have no idea why I'm on a mailing list for Rick Scott, but it probably has to do with the fact that I go to I've probably been to his campaign site, I've probably been to his personal Facebook page and researching videos and stuff like that. At some point somewhere, I probably got signed up for a mailing list. There are some helpful little actual bits of truth and things that I feel are worth discussing in this email. But first, let's talk about how it pertains to the Kavanaugh hearings, because obviously that's the premise that he opens on. In case I hadn't heard yet, in case I was in the bathroom, my buddy Rick just wanted to let me know that Senate had confirmed Judge Kavanaugh. He brings up kind of the nightmare confirmation process. Here's the thing. Everything about the Kavanaugh confirmation process tested my resolve between what I knew was right morally as a human being and what I knew was right as a student of politics and a student of history. So let me start at the beginning. I personally would not have wanted to see Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. Now, I want you to understand, this is not a condemnation of, or even an assessment of, Brett Kavanaugh as an arbiter of the law, as a human being, or anything. This is because, well, for the same reason that he was nominated by a Republican president, and for the same reason that Republican senators fought so hard to confirm him, because he is objectively a right-leaning person. And in my opinion, this pushes the balance of the Supreme Court too far to the right. Now understand, I am a Republican. I am a right-leaning person. And you might be asking yourself, well, you wouldn't say that you didn't want to see another right-leaning senator or right-leaning congressman elected because there were too many already, would you? And no, I wouldn't. But the Supreme Court is a different entity entirely. You may have heard the term in the past, a system of checks and balances. The Supreme Court is the ultimate check on the rest of the government. Let me give you a scenario, if you would, to run through in your head with me. Say that at some point in time, one side or the other, the Republicans or the Democrats, gains almost total superiority in all branches of government. They control 400 of the 435 congressional seats. They hold 90 out of the 100 Senate seats. They hold the White House. They hold all the legislative control. What is to stop this political party from then moving to do things outside the spirit of the Constitution, outside the boundaries of what our founding fathers envisioned in creating this country, thereby oppressing anybody who is then the political minority? I want to edit in a brief addendum here, and I'm going to keep it short because I don't want to make this video any harder to edit. But when I talk about the oppression of a political minority, those of you on the right, I want you to consider the way that certain websites here on the internet have actively worked to suppress people who were trying to espouse ideas that differed from their own in any way, shape, or form. Now, think about this. Except for, imagine that the people doing the oppressing was the government themselves. Imagine that instead of being stopped from espousing your views only on a particular website or platform, you were actively stopped from espousing your views anywhere that your views were labeled as harmful or toxic in general by law and legislation, and not just by the policies of a particular company who happens to host videos or host personality pages on the internet. That's what it is that we're trying to fight here when I say that the Supreme Court should not be politicized. That is what the Supreme Court is here to protect against. There is the order of precedence of laws, from the bottom being like town charters and things like that, all the way up to the Constitution of the United States of America, which is what's called the supreme law of the land. And the Supreme Court's job is to assure that any other law does not impede or damage a more powerful law, a superseding law. But the point is, there is an order of precedence to these things that are designed so that in the future, if some group somehow took over our political system, if they got voted into every public office, they would not be able to contort and distort our country and its laws into something nefarious. That is the failsafe that is the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court should never be politicized. Whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, that should be foremost in your mind when it comes to the concept of nominating a Supreme Court justice. If we lose the moderate justice, we need to replace them with a moderate justice. If we lose a left-leaning justice, they need to be replaced with a left-leaning justice. And if we lose a right-leaning justice, they need to be replaced with a right-leaning justice. There should always be a balance of 4-4-1, or as close to it as we can possibly get while still selecting from a pool of qualified candidates. I feel that our founding fathers would have written that into law if they would know how polarized and politicized our country would become one day. But they couldn't have really known that we would end up with a distinct, definitive two-party system that was insurmountable, and all the other things that have led to where we are today. However, that contradicts my feelings as a good and decent person, because once the Kavanaugh hearings commenced and once everything happened, I could not, as a moral human being, think about Judge Kavanaugh and his family and say this guy shouldn't get confirmed, because through no fault of his own, most likely, if we're realistic with ourselves, he was absolutely destroyed by a concerted effort of half the U.S. government over a struggle between them and the other half of the U.S. government, and not because of anything that Brett Kavanaugh himself had done. Right. Which brings us to the second issue, which is, I guess you could say, the finding of fact when it came to the accusations against Judge Kavanaugh. Because the reality of the situation is that the senators who brought this up and the senators who fought so hard to impede Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation should have realistically looked at the situation and said to themselves this: even if I choose to, for my own personal reasons, say that I will never not believe somebody who says they were sexually assaulted, no matter what, ever, the reality is it is my responsibility as an elected official of this government to follow the rules and regulations and laws of this government. And despite the fact that I personally may require no evidence, the reality is that the laws of this country do require that evidence. And in this particular case, even if I personally believe that Judge Kavanaugh is guilty, the fact is that there is no way to prove that. Not only do I not think that you could meet the burden of proof for a conviction in a court of law, I don't think you could meet the burden for a grand jury indictment. Well, maybe for a grand jury indictment, because the burden of proof for a grand jury indictment, I believe, is only probable cause. I think it would be probable cause. I definitely don't think that it meets the burden of a preponderance of evidence, and it sure as hell doesn't even come close to meeting the burden of proof that would be beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the burden of proof for a criminal allegation in the United States of America. That should be it. That should be it. Now, on the other side of things, you have the situation that was caused when this allegation was, regardless, made the primary issue in the Kavanaugh confirmation, which is that we have now crossed a threshold. We can no longer just choose to acknowledge the fact that there is an allegation, but that it doesn't meet any substantial standards of evidence. We instead have to acknowledge the fact that this is now in front of us, which creates another quandary, that now we are going to set a dangerous precedent either way. We have the choice to either go ahead and vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh, in which case we then set the standard that from now on until the future, governmental proceedings supersede court and criminal proceedings. Again, this is not a criminal proceeding. Even if there was evidence, it's beyond the statute of limitations, although there could have been grounds for some sort of civil case if there was evidence, which, as we established, whether you believe Judge Ford or not is irrelevant. The fact is there isn't evidence. And we're talking about politics, we're talking about the law, and that's what matters, not your opinion. Your opinion doesn't matter. My opinion doesn't matter. But if we hold up Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation, then we set the standard that any allegation of misconduct, no matter how spurious or lacking in evidence it is, can then be used to stall political proceedings until such time as it is convenient for the accuser to then withdraw their claim and allow the vote to go through. Because make no mistake, by allowing an FBI investigation, despite the fact that we can clearly see there is no evidence, what we are doing is saying that we are okay with an indefinite holding of these proceedings. At that point, we have to continue to let the FBI investigate over and over and over as long as they want, because they're never going to turn up any new evidence for the accuser, nor could they possibly turn up any evidence for the defense, because how can you turn up evidence that something didn't happen unless they somehow miraculously stumble upon footage on some early security camera of Brett Kavanaugh being 5 states away at the time? So we are forced to set a dangerous precedent no matter what we do. And that's exactly where we come to the end of Rick Scott's email here. Because the problem, regardless, these are legitimate, logical concerns that a person could have. But the fact that the vote is split down party lines tells me that this is not an issue that these congressmen and these senators are voting on logically. Because the odds of them then drawing a logical legal conclusion down party lines is absurd. But is the solution that Rick Scott brings up here that we need to set term limits on Congress, on the representatives, and on the Senate? I would assume he means the senators too, and not just the representatives, since he is running for Senate, right? He would want a term limit himself. Is that the solution? Well, first off, let's acknowledge that there is some merit to that, because some senators and some representatives, when they enter their last term, would no longer need to seek re-election to that office. But I'm sure they would still seek election to some office in most cases. Like, we see most representatives try and move on to the Senate, and a lot of senators try and move on to the White House or to being a governor, or governors move on to being a senator in the case of my buddy Rick himself. But overall, it doesn't really change the main crux of the problem. And it creates another problem, because then, as we're term limiting out qualified candidates, the best qualified people you could argue to hold these positions, since they're the people who ended up with them by the vote of the people, we are then forced to choose from less qualified candidates and then less qualified candidates than them, and so on and so forth. And I don't think that just new people aging into qualification would overcome the amount of people who were term limited out of qualification. No, here's my counter suggestion, Rick, since you were so nice as to ask my opinion on the issue. And bear with me here, because I know this might sound counterintuitive at first, but I'm going to explain a little bit. I think that we need to extend congressional terms for both representatives and senators. Now, I could argue senators, maybe you could leave alone, but I would say in the spirit of this idea, extend senators out to an 8-year term, right? In the case of representatives, a 2-year term is ridiculous, and it's exactly what's causing this problem. They need to be extended out to a 4-year term, and maybe even staggered, like the senators are staggered right now. And here's my reasoning, right? If you look at the life cycle of a term of a representative, especially one in a potentially challenged district, right? One in a district that is not hard red or hard blue, one in a district that has maybe been redrawn in the last census, etc., etc., etc. They face the potential of having to campaign for their seat every 2 years. And when we look at the fact that nowadays these campaign cycles broadly, and especially if you include planning for them, oftentimes last 14 to 18 months, you see the problem. They're spending 3/4 of their time probably more focused on campaigning to keep their job than they are on actually doing their job. I mean, to put that in perspective, what if you were forced to spend 6 hours of every 8-hour workday going into your boss's office and talking to them to convince them why they should let you keep your job? That would be an absurd way to require somebody to operate as an employee. And it's absurd that we require our representatives to operate as an employee, and then we question the fact that they're so politicized. Heck yeah, they're so politicized. They have to spend almost 3/4 of their time campaigning to keep their job. So extend the representatives' terms to 4 years, and while we're at it, bump the senators' terms to 8 years. That then dramatically increases the percentage of their time that they have to spend campaigning. That will cut back on people making decisions for publicity instead of making decisions because that is the right way to carry out the law of the United States and the will of the people. There you go, Rick. I hope that was of help to you. And for the rest of you, I hope that was of help to you too, or entertaining, or you learned something, or what have you. Guys, please like the video. Might not mean anything to you, it means something to me. Please subscribe to the channel. Again, same thing. Comment. Let me know what you want me to tell my buddy Rick about how he should pursue his job as a senator if he gets elected. And hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Peace.